Hello, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Print on China column, I explored the Chinese discourse on the visit of the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio to India. His visit to India has triggered a wide range of reactions in Chinese online discourse, where the focus has been more on what the trip signals strategically. So it was not really seen as a routine visit, not as a protocol or something that is just routine between India and the US. So the messaging behind the visit has been discussed on the Chinese internet, and a recurring question in these discussions is why the US appears to be placing this renewed emphasis on India. Why is US showing this warmth towards India, specifically what happened after last year after the tensions between the US and India? So the dominant interpretation is that Washington is now trying to repair and strengthen ties with New Delhi across multiple sectors, including defense, trade, energy, and most importantly, the Quad framework. And even a brief exchange during Rubio's press interaction in India circulated widely online in China, and particular reference was about this remark when a reporter made a politically charged remark or asked Rubio a question without really naming Donald Trump, and Rubio responded that every country has stupid people. It was, of course, an accidental response, but that comment became a viral moment meme on Chinese social media. But then, of course, apart from that, there has been a lot of discussion about the itinerary, the strategic signaling behind the visit. And Chinese commentary paid close attention to Rubio's itinerary. His first stop in India was Kolkata. Unlike the routine New Delhi visit or beginning with New Delhi, he started his visit to Kolkata, where he visited the missionaries of charity. And some users on Chinese internet interpreted this as soft power signaling, which linked humanitarian optics with diplomatic messaging. Then, of course, the focus was also on geopolitics. Some pointed to Kolkata's role as an industrial and port hub in eastern India, and some read the visit through supply chain restructuring and the China plus one strategy. So the sequencing of his trip also attracted analysis from a geopolitical perspective. Of course, the Bay of Bengal angle and his Kolkata visit was brought about, but then there was a bigger message, and that was that Rubio's earlier participation in the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Sweden, followed by the Quad foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi, was described by some Chinese commentators as deliberate diplomatic arc. And it wasn't really, the two visits were not really seen in isolation. And the visits were seen and interpreted as linking European security coordination with the Indo Pacific alignment. And of course, the diplomatic objectives were also being discussed on Chinese internet. And within Chinese strategic discussions, actually, the visit is framed around three objectives. The first is, and very obvious, is that the visit was aimed at repairing US India ties, and specifically after the attacks by Donald Trump, the trade dispute, the tariff war with India. And then also, it was seen in relation with how the US wants to give reassurance to India, specifically when Trump just went to China, and also somewhat perceived cordial ties between Pakistan and the US. Then the second aim that was being discussed on the Chinese internet and by strategic community is, of course, the Quad. And Rubio also participated in the Quad foreign minister meeting on the last day of his visit in India. So that was also seen as one of the major objectives of his visit, to revitalize the quadrilateral framework. And the third objective was seen as managing intensifying great power competition and to get India closer to the US in the US economic and strategic sphere and orbit. Then energy diplomacy is central to the reading in Chinese narrative here. Of course, what has happened in the Strait of Hormuz and the energy crisis, and also um, discouraging India to buy Russian oil. So Chinese discussions are also revolving around how energy diplomacy was important during Rubio's visit. And many Chinese posts argue that the US is using energy as leverage, and particularly efforts to reduce India's dependence on Russia's oil and encourage diversification towards US linked supplies. At the same time, academic voices introduce limits to this narrative. For example, Qian Feng, who is a scholar with the Institute for National Strategic Studies at Tsinghua University, argues that the US oil is unlikely to replace Middle Eastern energy sources in India's import structure in the near term. It might provide a substitute, but it is not an alternative to India's energy woes. Instead, it would function primarily as a diversification mechanism rather than a structural substitution. So, this distinction is important in Chinese analysis, where energy policy is seen as geopolitical signaling. And of course, apart from that, the Quad is was another major focus. And Quad is one of the most concerning arrangements from the Chinese perspective because it is seen as an anti-China coalition, specifically in China. So some Chinese commentators describe it as an inherently uneven, awkward mechanism where member states continue to pursue independent strategic calculations despite US efforts for coordination. But others argue that the Quad's effectiveness is heavily dependent on India and its participation, and that any drift that India is going to have towards Russia or China, it has potential to significantly weaken the US regional positioning, thereby the Quad and the Indo Pacific. Then a further strand of commentary suggests that the Quad is becoming less ideologically coherent. In my view, it was never about ideology, it was more about common interest. But the Chinese discussion is about that how there has been less ideological coherence, and rather than becoming a rigid anti China bloc coalition, it is increasingly seen as a flexible framework that is shaped by shifting US priorities and broader multipolar adjustments. And in this reading, when the US shifting priorities are being discussed, so it is also being discussed from the perspective of how it is being focused more on Russia and less on China. Then there is, of course, a lot of discussion about how India's balancing role is important for the US. And Chinese discourse on India itself is mixed, and it ranges from infrastructure mocking to how India is so significant in geopolitical balancing. Some online commentary was critical. It focused on the infrastructural gap or developmental contrast between India and China. And in fact, there were a lot of discussion and commentary on how Rubio was received on Kolkata airport that is now aging. There was pollution, and how there have been such high temperatures in North India. So they were using these examples as contrast between India and China. And there was this idea in Chinese discourse that how Rubio has now understood that India cannot become the next China. But there is more analytical strands that emphasize India's strategic behavior. And a common interpretation is that the US is attempting to use India as a counterweight to China again. However, this is balanced by an equally strong view that India is not a passive partner in this. India has its own agency, and India could actually be an active balancer. And Chinese observers describe Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy as, of course, one that is full of strategic autonomy, multi alignment, where India engages the US, Russia, even China, and other major powers without any binding alignment and without any alliance security structure. So, of course, this is framed as multi alignment that allows India to extract strategic space from great power competition. And in this respect, Shanghai Institute for International Studies scholar Liu Zhongyi, who's also a commentator on India's foreign policy, China's relationship with South Asia, he adds another layer to this debate, who argue that the US and its partners are actively supporting India's industrial base, supply chain diversification, primarily to reduce dependence on China. But he also questions whether India can realistically replicate China's manufacturing scale. So, all in all, Chinese discourse interprets Rubio's visit as part of the US broader strategy policy to consolidate Indo Pacific influence through diplomacy, energy policy, and security coordination. But there's also a consistent undercurrent of uncertainty. And the idea is, even as US India ties become somewhat better and the Quad appear to be at least alive, or eventually it might be strengthened, but Chinese analysis repeatedly returns to India's balancing behavior. And it suggests that the relationship still remains fluid, conditional, and shaped by shifting geopolitical calculations rather than fixed alignment. But in my view, what is happening is that China seems confused as of now. That after Trump's somewhat successful or perceivably successful visit to China, Rubio was transported to India, who's considered as a China hawk, who is also still sanctioned in China. And he focused on India being an important strategic partner. He focused on the Indo Pacific, the US priorities in the Indo Pacific, and also the coordination among the Quad countries. So China is absolutely concerned about the Quad. China is concerned about the coordination among four countries. So there is this hidden message behind the discourse and behind the strategic analysis discussion on the Quad on Rubio's visit to India. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.